He writes, "I am utterly amazed, utterly enchanted. I have a precursor, and what a precursor! I hardly knew Spinoza. That I should have turned to him just now was inspired by instinct. Not only is his overall tendency like mine, namely to make all knowledge the most powerful affect, but in 5 main points of his doctrine I recognise myself. This most unusual and loneliest of thinkers is closest to me precisely in these matters. He denies the freedom of the will, teleology, the moral world order, the unegoistic and evil. Even though the divergences are admittedly tremendous, they are due more to the difference in time, culture and science. In summa, my lonesomeness, which, as on very high mountains, often made it hard for me to breathe and make my blood rush out, is now at least a twosomeness." Okay, onto our paper. Among the many similarities between Nietzsche and Spinoza, there is one that regularly attracts condemnation in similar terms, namely their understanding of human being in terms of power. The complaint that Spinoza does not provide us with the means to condemn tyrannical government or even murder is echoed in characterisations of Nietzsche as an apologist for aristocratic forms of social and political hierarchy. In both cases, critics move too quickly from their naturalistic approach to human value to the conclusion that their philosophies do not and cannot support other regarding and democratic forms of life. Against this conclusion, we argue that given the right conditions, they do support cooperative and democratic political orders. However, it is true that in the absence of any single normative conception of human life and value, Spinoza and Nietzsche are both confronted with the problem of explaining how such forms of life might come about. In the absence of universal moral norms, how are they possible? The second aim of this paper is to suggest that for both Spinoza and Nietzsche, the solution to this problem relies on the role of the exemplar. So, first section, this is Spinoza on power and perfection. For Spinoza, all things, including human beings, are expressions of the power of God or nature. His conception of power is simple in that the power of God or nature exhausts all that is. It's complex insofar as this power may be expressed in a variety of distinct ways, through individual modes, such as a human being or a horse, through the laws peculiar to particular kinds of being, such as human nature or equine nature, and through complex modal compositions, such as states or polities. Power is differentiated not only quantitatively, but also qualitatively. As Spinoza explains, the powers of individuals, I quote, differ from one another, not only in degree, but also essentially. I'm still quoting, "For though a mouse depends on God as much as an angel does, and sadness as much as joy, a mouse cannot on that account be a kind of angel, nor sadness a kind of joy." So while each mode has the capacity to express itself within the range of its determinate quantity of power, each mode's essence also involves a definite quality of power. There's no natural hierarchy among the powers or perfections that pertain to individuals or types of beings. So, for example, a horse would not become more perfect or more powerful if it were to be changed into a human being. On the contrary, Spinoza says, it would be destroyed as much if it were turned into a human being as if it were turned into an insect. Nature does not accord human being any privilege over other beings. We do not stand to wider nature, as he puts it, as a dominion within a dominion or a kingdom within a kingdom. Just as fish are determined by nature to swim, human beings are determined by nature to think. Thus, although both a fish and a man express a determined quantity of the power of nature, each does so through a qualitatively unique essence. A thing is said to become more or less perfect when its power of acting, understood in terms of its own nature, its fishiness or its humanness, is increased or diminished. However, Spinoza rejects the idea that God or nature entails any intrinsic ends, purpose or design. He thus rules out the notion that nature can provide us with models of excellence, for example, Homo sapiens or Equus, against which individuals, for example, Alexander or Bucephalus, could be judged as more or less perfect tokens. Perfection and imperfection, he says, are extrinsic notions, and so provide us with knowledge about the relations between things rather than knowledge about the things themselves. Other value terms, such as good, evil, pious, wicked, and so on, pertain to human nature only, and have no purchase in relation to the eternal order of the whole of nature, as he puts it, in which man is but a particle. However, even though he takes final causes and universal ideas, including the idea of an exemplar, to be fictions or modes of thinking, he does not deny their utility for human life. Notions of perfection and imperfection, for example, can provide useful guides to the human effort, the conatus, the striving, to persist, helping us to attain joy or avoid sadness, along with their correlative increase or decrease in our power. Next section, Nietzsche on power and perfection. Like Spinoza, Nietzsche regards all things as complex expressions of power, and like Spinoza, his will-to-power theory does not claim that all things seek power over their environment or that they seek self-preservation, but rather that everything seeks to exercise or express its own distinctive capacities. Whether or not that leads to self-preservation or to power over things will depend on the intrinsic capacities of the body concerned and on the environment in which it seeks to exercise its power. What is important, I'm quoting from Beyond Good and Evil, what is important is that a living thing desires above all to vent its strength. Life as such is will to power. Self-preservation is only one of the indirect and most frequent consequences of it. Applied to human beings, this theory takes on a further dimension by virtue of the fact that to a greater degree than all other living things, human beings are conscious of and affected by their actions. This implies that there is an inescapable interpretative element in human action. We act in the light of particular ways of understanding or describing the meaning, goals, and content of our actions. There is also a particular kind of feedback loop between an agent's actions and the agent's self-esteem or self-respect. When the action is misdirected or blocked, the agent experiences a feeling of impotence or powerlessness. When it succeeds or is believed to have succeeded, the agent experiences a feeling of power. The feeling of power is the decisive element in many of Nietzsche's analyses of human agency throughout Human All Too Human and Daybreak. For example, in his analyses of gratitude, revenge, and pity. The desire on the part of those who suffer to incite pity in others arises because of the feeling of superiority that is achieved by demonstrating that, whatever their misfortune, the one arousing pity still has the power to elicit this response from others. This feeling of superiority provides, he says, a sort of pleasure, and it follows that the desire to excite pity is, he says, a thirst for self-enjoyment at the expense of one's fellows. In Daybreak, Nietzsche suggests that the pleasure obtained from practicing or witnessing cruelty to other animals, one of the oldest festival joys of mankind, he says, can be understood as a form of gratification of the feeling of power. On the genealogy of morality reiterates the claim that cruelty was part of the festive joy of the ancients. And indeed, he mentions Spinoza in support of the idea that disinterested malice, or what Spinoza called the sympathia malevolens, was for a long time considered a normal human attribute, this disinterested malice. It was part of the context in which the phenomenon of punishment could emerge, namely on the basis of the equivalence between the injury suffered and, I quote, the pleasure of having the right to exercise power over the powerless without a thought. A passage from On the Genealogy of Morality sums up Nietzsche's mature doctrine of the will to power as it applies to human beings. I quote again, every animal instinctively strives for an optimum of favourable conditions in which it can express fully its power and achieve its maximal feeling of power. Like Spinoza, Nietzsche was a perfectionist thinker in a certain sense, although one whose focus was not individual but generic perfection. He was concerned with the future attainment of the highest possible form of the human species as a whole. He suggests that the ultimate standard against which all forms of morality should be judged is the attainment, I quote, of the highest power and splendour of the human type. Like Spinoza, he insisted on the importance of knowledge of human nature for the flourishing of humankind. For example, in the context of suggesting that, quote, man has to set himself ecumenical goals embracing the whole earth, now that people no longer believed in a God who, I quote again, directs the destinies of the world. And he insisted on the need to achieve, I quote again, a hitherto altogether unprecedented knowledge of the preconditions of culture as a scientific standard for ecumenical goals. Herein, he says, lies the tremendous task facing the great spirits of the coming century. Following section has the title Spinoza on Political Community and the Role of Religion. Spinoza's study of biblical narratives and language in the first half of the theologico-political treatise, which, if you don't mind, I'll just refer to as TTP because it's such a mouthful, so the theological political treatise. Spinoza's study of biblical narratives and language in the first half of the TTP shows that the prophets appealed to the imagination in order to convey simple ideas that encourage obedience. Scripture neither contains nor aims for an adequate knowledge of nature. Rather, he says, I quote, it teaches only what men can imitate by definite code of conduct. Some read the TTP as a condemnation of the Bible, theology and faith, on the grounds that these promote false beliefs, for example, God as a judge, and sad passions, for example, fear and hope, that prevent the development of knowledge and rationality. According to Spinoza, however, imagination is a power, and the knowledge to which it gives rise, though partial or inadequate and of a low variety, is nevertheless of enormous social utility. His account of the institution of the Jewish state in the TTP after the exile from Egypt makes it clear that even though human beings are largely ignorant of the laws of nature and of their own nature, and even though their varied desires tend to make them natural enemies of each other, nevertheless, peace and security can be achieved through the right use of passion and imagination. Imagination is knowledge of the lowest kind, the first kind, and while it is certainly partial or mutilated, as he puts it, I quote, it is knowledge nonetheless. And yet this knowledge is not mere ignorance, it's not mere illusion. Spinoza stresses over and again that the prophets enjoyed an extraordinary power of imagination, not of intellect, and that it's the force of their imaginative constructions that succeed in promoting obedience to the law. So Moses created one people under one law by appealing to fundamental passions that all share, that is, fear and hope. Mosaic law provided a common standard with which everyone could comply, binding the affects of all in a manner that produced conformity. Each is brought to fear the same punishment and hope for the same reward. It is true that behaviour founded on fear and coercion is certainly not the same as that founded on instruction and understanding. This difference, after all, marks off passion from action, or reactivity from activity, and theology from philosophy. But Spinoza holds that the latter is an achievement of history, and its emergence depends on the former. So, for example, philosophy depends on theology. Indeed, fear, hope and coercion must always remain important mechanisms through which all societies seek to maintain order and security. In the latter half of the TTP, Spinoza aims to identify and demonstrate the workings of the universally valid axioms of the whole of nature by which polities, like all modal existence, are determined and to which they must adapt. The state of nature is a condition, he says, without religion and without law, and consequently without sin and without wrong. A sovereign power does not and cannot enforce pre-existing natural law for the simple reason that there is no natural law capable of enforcement. The great achievement of sovereign power is to make law, and I think the most definitive demonstration of that in Spinoza's political theological work is the brilliant book published by Susan James last year on the TTP. That is the great achievement of sovereign power, to make law. It doesn't discover it, it constructs it. Each state will make its own distinctive laws and construct its own distinctive religion and morality. There are laws of human nature that set natural limits to sovereign power. A sovereign does not have the power to command a subject, I'm quoting, to hate one to whom he is indebted, to love one who has done him harm, or to refrain from taking offence at insults, or from wanting to be free of fear. Moreover, human nature is constituted such that, and I quote again, it will not submit to unlimited repression. So even though each state develops its own ways of life and normative character, it does so within the constraints of the determination of nature, including human nature. Spinoza's account of law, in other words, is thoroughly naturalistic. Religion, law and morality develop according to the invariant principles of nature, including human nature. This produces variability because law and morality develop under specific conditions and in specific times and places. Understanding the particular character of any given people or nation requires attending to its history. Thus, the law of Moses, I quote, was specially adapted to the character and preservation of one particular people and has no universal application. Nature does not supply ready-made citizens or subjects, but only individuals who happen to share a common history and who, over time, will take on a particular character, as he puts it, a particular mode of life, as he puts it again, and a particular set of attitudes that define their collective identity, what we might call their second nature. Spinoza is undoubtedly contextualist on this point. Each state will institute and regulate its own particular construction of religion, of law, and of moral norms. It follows that the normative lives of distinct peoples will necessarily differ. We noted that for Spinoza, a thing is said to become more or less perfect when its power of acting, understood in terms of its own nature, is increased or diminished. From this point of view, it is not simply the quantity of power possessed by a state that distinguishes it from others, but the quality of that power and its capacity to increase the power of action or perfection of those whom it governs. In these terms, a state that rules exclusively by threats, fear, and punishment shows its lack of power. The type of power that tyrants enjoy is weak, and their knowledge of nature, including human nature, is inadequate. Such states can be judged less perfect than others because they prevent the development of the qualitatively unique human powers of thought and understanding. But what makes democracy a more perfect state form than tyranny? Why should we prefer a democratic state to a tyrannical state? As we have noted, nature has no normative structure. The laws by which it is self-governed are not commands, so they can't be broken and they can't be disobeyed. This is the reason why we cannot imitate God or take him as an exemplar, as Spinoza says. Value is an entirely human achievement, but one that takes place entirely within nature. This means that the conditions that govern the emergence of human values, laws and institutions will follow natural laws that can be revealed. In turn, such understanding can assist the human endeavour to preserve ourselves and to increase our powers of action. It can indicate what are the most enabling values and norms. For Spinoza, as we noted earlier, the distinguishing feature of human beings is that we're determined by nature to think. That is, to imagine, to judge, and to try to understand ourselves, nature, and others. Just as fish are determined to swim and do so by sovereign natural right, human beings are determined to think, and this we do by a sovereign natural right that cannot be transferred or surrendered by any social compact. The only inalienable natural human right, by my lights anyhow, that Spinoza recognises is this right to think. From a purely descriptive point of view, a sovereign who countermands this right attempts to assert a right to which his power does not extend, and so it or he risks bringing about its own ruin. It would be idle to condemn such a sovereign because it condemns itself by its own actions. From a normative point of view, and this can only mean from the point of view of human flourishing, human values, from a normative point of view, tyrannies can be criticised for failing to understand that the ultimate purpose of the state is to preserve natural human right in a way that allows each to enjoy life. As Spinoza puts it, it's not the purpose of the state to create beasts or puppets. Rather, he says, it's to enable human beings to develop their mental and physical faculties in safety, to use their reason without restraint, and to refrain from the strife and the vicious mutual abuse that are prompted by hatred, anger, or deceit. Thus, he says, the purpose of the state is in reality freedom. From his earliest writings, Spinoza linked the achievement of our highest good with the collective human endeavour to form a kind of society that would allow as many as possible to perfect the intellect and to attain this good. The best and most powerful kind of state, then, is one that recognises the human power of thought and that constitutes itself in a way that facilitates the fullest expression and development of this power by the greatest possible number. Democracy, according to Spinoza, comes closest to the natural state because it recognises and promotes, I quote, that freedom which nature grants to every man. Parts 4 and 5 of the Ethics contain Spinoza's argument for why a philosophical understanding of God or nature and the nested place of human nature within the rest of nature necessarily entails the desire for mutual aid, friendship, honour and justice. The attainment of our highest power and perfection can be achieved only in concert with other individuals whose active powers are mutually enhancing, namely, obviously, other human beings. The problem for Spinoza is not what is to count as the highest good, nor how to bind knowledge of it to the desire for it, but rather how to bring human being to recognise that its essential power or highest perfection is this power to understand. Given that neither God nor nature can provide us with an image or a model of human excellence, and taking into account that values and norms necessarily will vary across time and place, the problem of positing an ideal of perfection at which we might aim seems insoluble. If God or nature does not provide human being with either an exemplar or a moral law, then upon what basis do judgments concerning good and evil rest? Spinoza's response to the normative problem, we will argue, centres on the construction of a fiction, an exemplar of human nature. And it's this notion that provides a bridge between power and morality and between nature and norms. The following section is entitled Nietzsche on Political Community and the Role of Religion. Nietzsche's attitude toward democracy was complex and varied over the course of his writings. During his so-called middle period, however, this is around 1880, He clearly saw the process of democratisation as both irresistible and valuable. He was critical of aspects of democratic political organisation as they existed in Europe around this time, in particular of the role of parties and of the corrupting influence exerted by wealth. He was aware of the many ways in which ordinary citizens lacked the independence of thought and opinion necessary for genuine democracy. He regarded democracy as a form of political organisation, quote, that wants to create and guarantee as much independence as possible, independence of opinion, of mode of life, and of employment. But he distinguished this ideal from the currently existing forms of democratic society by specifying that here he is speaking of democracy, I quote, as of something yet to come. Nietzsche's attitude toward religion was no less ambivalent than his attitude toward democracy. Echoing Spinoza, he acknowledged the role of the Christian Church in educating the human spirit and producing some of the highest exemplars of humanity. On the other hand, he considered the ascetic ideal to be, I quote, a monstrous method of evaluation, the prevalence of which revealed, I quote again, the sickliness of the type man who has lived up till now. For Nietzsche, the means discovered for creating the feeling of power, he says, almost constitute the history of culture. The reason is that for so much of human history, it was believed that natural phenomena were endowed with the power to frustrate human endeavours, and the feeling of impotence was widely and strongly felt. As a result, the feeling of power has become humankind's strongest propensity. Christianity, and more broadly, the aesthetic ideal on which it is based, have long been among the most important cultural means of creating and maintaining the feeling of power. On the Genealogy of Morality outlines how this works. The valuation of human life put forward by the ascetic priest is fundamentally nihilistic, insofar as it judges ordinary life from the perspective of a different kind of spiritual life that opposes ordinary life and condemns it, quote, unless it should turn against itself and deny itself, end of quote. The ascetic priest treats corporeal life as a bridge or a path to another, higher form of life. He represents, quote, the incarnate wish for being otherwise, being elsewhere. As such, the ascetic priest provides a means through which, quote, the whole herd of failures, the disgruntled, the underprivileged, the unfortunate, and all who suffer from themselves can retain their hold on life. Close the quote. The fact that this mode of evaluation arises so often must mean that it answers some deep need in human life itself. It is an evaluation that, although hostile to life, is one that, quote, life itself must have an interest in preserving. As Nietzsche describes the situation, I quote again, the ascetic ideal springs from the protective and healing instincts of a degenerating life which uses every means to maintain itself and struggles for its existence. In it and through it, life struggles with death and against death. The ascetic ideal is a trick for the preservation of life. It's in the Genealogy of Morality. The historic mission of the ascetic priest is to rule over and care for the sick herd, those who do not only suffer, but who embody ressentiment and slave morality. He defends the sick herd against itself, and I quote, against anarchy and the ever-present threat of the inner disintegration of the herd, where that most dangerous of blasting and explosive materials, ressentiment, continually piles up. The ascetic priest deals with this threat by telling the sufferers that they themselves are to blame for their suffering, thereby redirecting ressentiment. The priest is the direction changer of ressentiment. Thus, the historical mission of the ascetic priest is to render the sick harmless by giving their ressentiment a backwards direction, enabling them to use their own suffering as a means of self-discipline, self-surveillance, and self-overcoming. Moreover, according to Nietzsche, the concepts by means of which he achieves this mission are entirely fictional. Guilt, sin, sinfulness, corruption, damnation, and the like. Quote, "The fact that someone feels guilty, sinful, by no means proves that he is right in feeling this way." Nietzsche's fundamental objection to priestly medication is that it combats only the condition and not the cause of suffering. However, he does not deny that it does alleviate suffering and console the sufferer. This is the genius of Christianity and all ascetic religions. They employ a whole series of techniques designed to combat lethargy, world weariness, and pessimism of spirit. These include forms of fasting and meditation, mechanical activity, the life of routine, discipline, and even the small pleasures of giving pleasure and comfort to others. Love thy neighbour. These are all means to arouse the feeling of power. The formation of a herd is another means to arouse the feeling of power. It awakens a communal feeling of power. Quote, "Wherever there are herds, it is the instinct of weakness that has willed the herd and the cleverness of priests that has organised it." A primary means employed by the ascetic priest involves the anaesthetising of pain by the arousal of an excess of feeling, which for the Christian priest is achieved by means of the feeling of guilt. By means of the concept of sin, the priest is able to present the suffering of man as punishment, and to present the cure for this condition as attainable only in another world, the kingdom of God. Nietzsche allows that this system of interpretation was a means for the improvement of mankind, but at what cost? He refers to it as a catastrophe in the history of the health of European humanity, and also, so far as the New Testament is concerned, a ruination of spiritual health. Nietzsche's problem, therefore, is to provide an alternative ideal. This means not only another non-nihilistic and affirmative evaluation of existence, but also a means of communicating this ideal that does not reproduce the forms of dependency and weakness that gave rise to the ascetic ideal in the first place. His solution to this problem takes the form of a philosophical fiction. Thus spake Zarathustra. The next section is called Exemplar and Norm in Spinoza. For Spinoza, any worthwhile normative theory should be nested within a broader theory of nature. However, the acquisition of knowledge about human nature, broader nature, and their interconnectedness is an ongoing project. In the meantime, we still need to live and to make judgments about morality. In this task, Spinoza does not shy away from making full use of experience, imagination, and fiction. In the context of his deliberations about the basis for moral norms in both the TTP and the ethics, he makes use of the idea of an imaginative universal, or the exemplar, the model. The role of the exemplar is crucial to understanding Spinoza's views on normative political and ethical philosophy. Spinoza's problem, to repeat, is how to bring human being to recognise that its essential power, or highest perfection, is the endeavour to understand itself and its relation to the rest of nature. His solution is to posit a model, an ideal, or a hypothetical standard on the basis of which value can be defined and right conduct urged. In the preface to Part 4 of the Ethics, Spinoza explains that notions of perfection and imperfection are simply imaginative modes of thought that human beings employ to indicate their approval or disapproval of the various things that they encounter. Nature does not contain failure or sin or imperfection because there is no end or aim or goal at which nature tends. Good and evil are likewise, he says, modes of thinking that arise from the pursuit of human ends, and they do not have an independent existence in nature. Nevertheless, Spinoza maintains, we must retain these terms, that is, perfection, imperfection, good and evil, because, understood in the appropriate way, they assist the human endeavour for self-preservation and for the increase of human joy. Perfection must be understood to mean the same thing as reality, he says. That is, an individual may be said to be more or less perfect, more or less real, when its power of action, understood in terms of its own nature, is increased or diminished. So the more I act, the more perfect, the more real I am, the more I'm self-caused in a sense, the more I'm acted on, the less real, the less perfect I am, and the more something else is asserting its manner of being. Spinoza writes, I quote, "I shall understand by good what we certainly know is a means by which we may approach nearer and nearer to the model or the exemplar of human nature that we set before ourselves. By evil, what we certainly know prevents us from becoming like that model." Next, I'm still quoting, next, we shall say that men are more perfect or imperfect insofar as they approach more or less near to this model. One striking feature of defining good and evil in this way is that it makes normative judgment a deeply empirical, even experimental matter. Spinoza's model of human nature is no less an imaginative universal, a fiction, than other universals that he had, universal definitions of human being that he'd rejected earlier in the ethics, that include an animal capable of laughter, a featherless biped, a rational animal, and so on. Why then does Spinoza engage in feigning a universal model for human being, and how might such feigning help to solve our normative problem? What makes human beings especially useful to each other and what draws them together is the similarity of their powers. The one inalienable natural right that all human beings share is the natural right to think, that is, to imagine, to judge, and to try to understand themselves and their context, nature. At the same time, the TTP makes clear that in the state of nature, this similarity in power makes us natural enemies. I quote, "Each man wants others to live according to his way of thinking, approving what he approves and rejecting what he rejects." Each nation or state attempts to solve this problem by persuading all to live under one law, but this only adds to the difficulty of identifying a universal human essence, because each nation or state will develop its own way of life or its own second nature, which each nevertheless will uphold as the correct, the only, the right, the natural way to live. The enmity between individuals in the state of nature is writ large in the belligerent relations between nation-states. Spinoza's conception of human nature appears to be thoroughly underdetermined, and the notion of the similarity of human essence seems too thin to supply a universal exemplar or model of human nature. Does it help that he claims that human beings are by nature imaginative and imitative, and that our effects are contagious? Well, yes and no. His theory about the contagiousness and the imitative human way of catching each other's emotions and affects, you think might be helpful, but the power of imitation, unfortunately, is indiscriminate. And even very wise and rational people, I think of department meetings, have difficulty maintaining their wisdom and reason when they are forced to live among other beings that do not agree at all with their nature. And interestingly, this includes non-human animals for Spinoza, that the imitation of the affects of non-human animals. Human nature is so unstable that he actually talks about the danger of imitating animals' affects. It's this instability of human nature, coupled with our imaginative and imitative powers, which necessitate the provision of an exemplar of human nature in the first place. It's posited as a guide to the human effort to reach its highest good, namely to achieve freedom, and what Spinoza refers to as blessedness. Spinoza was only too well aware that our knowledge is incomplete, and parts 4 and 5 of the Ethics offer a provisional and revisable philosophical exemplar of the wise and free person, as an image that might be emulated. The universal model of human nature that Spinoza offers should be understood as provisional because our knowledge is incomplete, revisable because our knowledge of ourselves and of nature increases, and general enough to be operational in a range of cultural and historical contexts. This is to meet the problem of the contextuality of norms. Nevertheless, Spinoza does provide us with a sketch of what might be, as he puts it, the temperament and manner of living of the human exemplar. The free man, he says, is not resentful, but repays hate, anger and disdain with love and nobility. The free man pities no one, does not think about death, but joyfully affirms life, acts honestly, does not act indirectly in order to avoid punishment or obtain reward, but acts directly through understanding, and, he says, by a certain eternal necessity, lives conscious of himself and of God or nature. But does Spinoza's philosophical use of the exemplar of the free man alter the fact that, as a universal idea, it's nevertheless a fiction? More pertinently, how does the exemplar offered in the Ethics differ from the theological exemplars, such as the imitation of God or the imitation of Christ? Why should one prefer the model of the free man to the model of the imitation of Christ? We suggest that there is a difference, and the difference concerns the manner in which the powers of imagination and imitation are deployed in each case. Spinoza counts imagination, as we've seen, as a kind of knowledge, an inferior kind, but nevertheless a kind of knowledge. There's nothing to prevent the rational deployment of the imagination, along with the power of imitation, in a self-aware way. After all, Spinoza claims in the Ethics, I quote, "The mind does not err from the fact that it imagines." It's not imagining itself that involves an error. It's the affirmations of what it is that you imagine that involves the errors. This is the essential difference we want to argue between a philosophical and a theological exemplar. In the former case, one self-consciously, in the philosophical case, one self-consciously creates a model, a fictional device that's put to work in the service of the enhancement of human life. It's this device that provides the means by which we can judge murder to be wrong and democratic forms of polity to be preferable to tyrannies. This is not to say, of course, that there is a law of nature that forbids murder or that God supports democratic societies, despite what George Bush may have claimed a few years ago. On Spinoza's view, there simply are no such transcendental warrants. Values, norms and enforceable laws are collective human constructs that are concerned to promote human interests and human well-being in an otherwise indifferent universe. Final brief section, Zarathustra as exemplar. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is Nietzsche's best known, although perhaps least well understood book, and the one to which he attached the greatest importance. He referred to Daybreak and Gay Science as, I quote, commentaries on Zarathustra written in advance of the text, and to Beyond Good and Evil as an explication written after the event. In 1886, he wrote that, I quote, "To have the prerequisite for understanding Zarathustra, all my earlier writings must be genuinely and profoundly understood. Also, the necessity and sequence of these writings and the development expressed in them." The meaning of this book, however, is far from clear. Commentators disagree on its place in Nietzsche's oeuvre, its structure, and on the nature of its central character, Zarathustra. In the brief time remaining, we can't presume to resolve the many interpretative difficulties that surround the work. However, we do want to suggest that the character Zarathustra embodies an ideal of a higher form of humanity, one that is proposed as an alternative to the Christian conception founded upon the ascetic ideal. Moreover, in explicit contrast to earlier prophets and teachers, He does not lay out a moral doctrine or a moral code for others to follow. Instead, he exemplifies a form of self-transformation or overcoming that turns on his acceptance of the idea that all life, his own included, returns eternally, and that results in a more independent and free-thinking type of human being, freed from the shackles of ressentiment. In this sense, Zarathustra is an exemplar of a higher degree of human perfection, in Spinoza's sense. Among the indications in the text of Thus Spoke Zarathustra that this character functions as an exemplar, consider first the narrative development, and second, the changing relationship of Zarathustra to his followers. At the outset, he appears in the guise of a prophet or teacher. Quote, "I teach you the overman. Man is something that should be overcome." Later, in Of the 1001 Goals, he proclaims one of the doctrines that he shares with Spinoza, namely that the evaluation of things as good or evil has no basis in nature, but is the work of peoples. Quote, "Verily, human beings have given themselves all their good and evil." Close that quote. A table of values hangs over every people, and all past tables of values have all been overcome and replaced by new ones. Zarathustra's view is that the human creation of all such tables of values should now be recognised and taken as the basis for new conceptions of good and evil. Earlier, in reference to the believers in a world behind the world, or afterworldsmen is a title that refers to a key element of the ascetic ideal mentioned earlier. In that text, he proclaims, quote, "I teach humankind a new will, to will this path that human beings have walked blindly and to call it good and no longer slink away from it like the sick and the moribund." Throughout all the teachings of Part 1, there is a strong underlying humanism insofar as tables of values, gods and virtues are all presented as entirely human products. To recognise this is to stay true to the meaning of the earth and to give the earth a human meaning. In Part 2, the character of Zarathustra begins to take on a different hue. He now realises that his teaching in Part 1 mirrors the teaching of those afterworldsmen that he had condemned. As he says in On the Blissful Islands, "Once one said God when one looked upon distant seas, but now I have taught you to say overman." As such, what he taught has the form of a new goal for humanity as a whole, but one that retains the structure of appealing to a future state of being that would justify and redeem the present. The rupture with the figure of Zarathustra as teacher deepens in Book 3, which is focused almost entirely on Zarathustra himself, retracing his personal spiritual odyssey. He becomes the object as well as the subject of the narrative. He speaks for the most part to himself, or to those aspects of himself which threaten to block his path, such as the spirit of gravity or his fool. At the beginning of Part 3, he presents himself as standing before his most difficult task, his loneliest wandering, which is also his personal way of greatness, his ultimate summit. This path that Zarathustra must take is vividly evoked in Of the Vision and the Riddle, in the form of a young shepherd who is convulsed and choking on a heavy black snake. The voice from within Zarathustra cries out, telling the shepherd to bite off the snake's head. He does so and is immediately transformed. Quote, "No longer a shepherd, no longer human, one transformed, surrounded with light, laughing, a laughter that was no human laughter." This is a vision of being choked by some piece of wisdom, overcoming it, and being transformed as a result. Zarathustra says that he is consumed by yearning for this supra-human laughter. At this point, it is apparent that there has been a further shift in his self-conception. He's no longer a teacher or a prophet attempting to spread a universal teaching, nor even a more discriminating teacher attempting only to present his vision, his highest hope. Rather, he is now embarked upon the attempt to realise that highest hope, to become his image of what it is possible for humans to be. Quote, once the Creator sought companions and children of his hope, and behold, it turned out that he could not find them, except he first create them himself. Thus, I am in the middle of my work. For the sake of his children must Zarathustra perfect himself. In Zarathustra's case, his own self-overcoming passes by way of the thought of eternal return. This is a serpent wisdom on which he choked. It remains for him to find the strength and the lion's voice to summon it up. To do so would be to overcome himself, to pass his own test. For the thought of eternal return is above all a test, a means of selection. This is how Nietzsche presents it in Gay Science 341, and how Zarathustra presents it in Of the Vision and the Riddle to the dwarf spirit of gravity, that is, as his abysmal thought, which the dwarf could not endure. At one level, Zarathustra's task in part 3 is to realise his own ideal, to be one who can will, who can enact his vision of human greatness, or more than human nature. On another level, his task is that of overcoming hostility and ressentiment towards life, of overcoming the spirit of revenge that has infected all conceptions of good and evil hitherto. To achieve this would be to become not merely reconciled with life, but capable of affirming it without qualification. At the end of part 3, in the second dance song, we hear Zarathustra profess his unqualified love of life. At a third level, Zarathustra's task is that of overcoming the spirit of gravity, which stands for all that teaches us to bear life, to experience it as a burden rather than as something light. The spirit of gravity stands for all those tables of values handed down to humankind, as opposed to those we might self-consciously create. Zarathustra no longer aspires to be a prophet, laying down the law for all humankind. We see him towards the end of Book 3 in Of Old and New Law Tables, surrounded by half-written new law tables. Zarathustra's path to greatness is his path to perfection. That is, a path to perfection in terms of his image of human perfection. If in achieving this he overcomes the human in himself, if he becomes overhuman, it is not because he becomes the overman, there's no such figure, but because he has overcome his own doubts about the value of life and affirmed its eternal recurrence. He has managed to silence the dwarf spirit of gravity who says, good for all, evil for all. Nietzsche repeats the point in many different ways, that this is Zarathustra's path to the future. But it's not the only path. Quote, this is just my way, where is yours? Thus I answered those who asked me, the way, for the way does not exist. Close the quote. He describes himself in Of Old and New Law Tables as a prelude to better players, but as one to be imitated rather than one who lays down new laws. Act according to my example. Act according to my example. In short, he is no longer a teacher, but an exemplar. Thank you.
So, Moira, thank you very much. Moira, and I should say thank you very much.
So you're going to answer all the questions, right?
Discussion. Who would like to begin?
Spinoza question, actually. I gather that you've raised this very big question about what's the relation between the natural order and the normative order in Spinoza. And part of the answer, as far as I understood it, was part of the criticism, part of the positive side of the philosophical conception is that both the religious conception and the philosophical conception involve fictions. But the philosophical conception self-consciously employs a fiction, whereas the religious, if you like, naively employs fictional devices. That is, it employs fictional devices without realizing they're fictional devices. But my question is, why should that matter? Why is it better to be self-aware? Why does it make a normative difference, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a very fair description, I think, of what I was arguing. The fictions of religion and of theology are harmless at their origin. So the prophets, he wants to say, are people with very, very strong, robust imaginations who see that, you know, they just have an understanding of human nature. They're just one of these people who just naturally have a certain kind of insight, and they just see what is going to be helpful in this situation. But they don't necessarily understand that. It's almost like an intuition in the everyday sense. And also they may experience their visions as coming from God, or they may experience their insight just as a natural power. So there's I think in the religious attitude, there is scope, I think, for a certain kind of self-awareness, but there would then also be an extraordinary capacity for deception, which Spinoza is very concerned about, because once those imaginings, which may be useful, well, they are useful, he argues, socially and culturally, in bringing a people together, in binding, you know, religio, in binding affect up. They allow a certain kind of peaceability and so on. But then if they confront people as true, as something external to them, not as something that they produce, then, you know, you can see where Marx, you know, following Spinoza and Feuerbach, gets, you know, the alienation and the mystification. And once you have that kind of situation, then there is enormous scope for the theologians in particular, combine the theologico-political, to block human development, because it can fill the imagination with pomp, ceremony, fears and hopes and so on. Why the philosophical exemplar or the philosophical fiction isn't worrying in that way, what's important about the presence or absence of self-awareness is reason, is rationality, is understanding that if we use an exemplar or a model as a guide, then we can flourish if it's a good exemplar or a good model. But once we understand the model is true, or as the only model, then, you know, this is where as Spinoza would say, the natural light of reason is blocked, because we stop understanding things, and you know, and rather the fictions are dominated, rather than us using the fictions, you know, the fictions are ruling us. So in other work that I'm doing, I'll just very quickly add this. In other work that I'm doing that Sue briefly mentioned, a theory of art, I think there's a similar point to be made. The artist is unlike the prophet, I think, insofar as the artist is aware of, not necessarily, I guess, but, you know, is aware of their vision as not being something that has entered them from the outside, but rather as a power that they have to imagine, rather than, you know, visitation from God or some such.
Just one little comment. I'm very happy with that answer, but I just want to note that it still ultimately comes to a valorization of reason. So we're beginning there, obviously.
Look, I'm happy for you to say that, provided that you bring with it all the Spinozistic baggage, which is that reason is always embodied, that reason is always historical, that reason always depends in part on a community of reasoners. So, the comment I made, one cannot remain rational if one is among deeply irrational people all the time. Reason cannot be maintained under those circumstances. So I'm happy for you to talk about valorisation of reason, provided that, one understands this is a very rich conception, in my view, of reason, where, it has to do with being embodied, it has to do with being in relation with others, it has to do with political life and so on.
Martin.
So Laura, great. This was a great start. Thank you. I heard you arguing that the Nietzschean perfection model is something like a variant or a radicalization of a Spinozian perfectionist trope. And let me give...
That's a question
that's
for
probably,
Paul. This is definitely a
no,
question
but you, since you were reading it, I hold you accountable for it. Let me give you a counter story. And let's distinguish three forms of perfectionism. I call them Aristotelian, Spinozian, Nietzschean. And I would argue that the Spinozian is much closer to the Aristotelian, and the Nietzschean is much more a break with the other two than you were seeming to imply. And I'll tell you why. And this has to do with the connection, the possible connection between human nature, perfection, and the knowledge of human nature. One could argue that in Aristotelianism, it's just a name for it, the norm, or that to which we should approach ourselves, is derived from the knowledge of human nature, which is accessible. So we see the internal criteria or standards in human nature. Approaching them means realizing them. In Spinozism, as you rightly pointed out, the Exemplar points to the fact that this knowledge is never to be had, because human nature is inexhaustible, let's say. We don't know what the body and the mind will do. So therefore we need a fictitious element filling this gap of knowability, let's say. But still there is an internal connection between knowing human nature and designing or projecting this kind of exemplar. And therefore still the model or the exemplar refers to human nature as something that could in principle be known and could be referred to positively, let's say. And I would argue that Nietzsche's own conception is a break with this idea. I think he would say perfection is not about knowing and not about human nature, because this is nothing you can approach at all, because this is a matter of experimenting, creating. And therefore Zarathustra seems like a philosopher, a knower in the first books of in the first parts of the book, but he ceases to be so. So he's a character. This is something that has to be lived, not known. And I expect you now to say, but this is what Spinoza says too. And I would say, no. Because in Spinoza, the exemplar still is that of a wise man, a knower. Whereas in Nietzsche, this seems to be something else, a liver, or an incorporated being doing things in which the more rational, reasonable, knowing-related parts are probably accidental, let's say, not essential. Whereas for Spinoza, of course, the essence of human nature is knowledge. And that, for me, seems to introduce a break, which might be the break, by the way, of philosophical modernity. And it could be that Spinoza, in this sense, is standing before this threshold, and a certain trust in knowledge or reason might, in a way, relate him to a more ancient universe, which may be fine. It can be, of course, I think, defended with many philosophical arguments. But you could pitch the Nietzschean invention, another exemplar, let's say, exactly against this.
So Paul and Maura, you might both like to...
But I'll just say something very briefly, because I think it is really a question for Paul. But you're right, Martin, we disagree, I think. I would think Spinoza is much closer to Nietzsche than to Aristotle, partly because, or even Aristotelian, if you're thinking of virtue ethics or whatever, because the notion of any kind of human essence in Aristotle or in Aristotelian approaches, I think is quite robust. Whereas I think the notion of a human essence in Spinoza really amounts to a degree of power. And I suppose for us to really thrash this out, we'd have to put our cards on the table about nominalism. Where do you stand vis-a-vis nominalism? And I think Spinoza probably is a nominalist. I think he doesn't have a very strong conception of what human nature is. And what I'd like Paul to talk about, if possible, is I think he's arguing vis-a-vis Nietzsche that the exemplar is individualistic. It's not a universal, like, be like this. You know, it's this is my way, what's yours? And I think, although I don't think that captures Spinoza's conception of the exemplar, I think nevertheless, he thinks human beings are similar. They're not the same. And I don't see how you can get a very robust conception of human nature out of Spinoza. What we have are individuals who have similar powers, but some of our powers are also similar to other kinds of beings to whom we could also join ourselves, and he thinks that would be a mistake.
All this could be known, so we could know.
Oh, sorry. And my other point, just let me finish, if I may, responding to your previous points. The distinction you make between Spinoza's exemplar of the free man as being a knower, whereas Zarathustra being a liver or whatever, I don't agree with either. I think if you look at the latter parts of part 4 and part 5 of the Ethics, I think Spinoza's very concerned there with the joyful enjoyment of life. And the eternity of the mind. Blessedness is about living in a certain kind of way, in this world. And it may just be a semantic disagreement, but reason, knowledge, and so on, these are, I understand how people sometimes can find such terms off-putting if they're defined narrowly. But I don't think Spinoza's exemplar is so much a knower as a thinker. I think that's because fish swim. We think. That's what we do. That's our major power. And one could argue that we think when we're dancing. It's not as if thinking is all about philosophy and knowledge. It could be broader.
We've got some more questions, but Paul.
Just briefly on that, I think Moira's last remarks do help to narrow the gap between Spinoza and Nietzsche and the figure of Zarathustra. Precisely because Nietzsche, above all, raises that question of what it is to know. This is one of the fundamental questions of the last part of On the Genealogy of Morality. Why the value attached to truth? And I do think that he has a conception of what it is to know that is bound up with a certain way of life, if you like, or a certain attitude toward life. And I think there's probably more to say about Zarathustra's own commitment to knowledge of a certain kind. I'm fairly sure that there are passages in which he does not. He also insists on the importance of knowledge and knowing. The passage that we quoted is one that comes from an earlier text in Human All Too Human, in fact, and there it's quite striking, I think, the degree to which Nietzsche, who's often portrayed as an anti-Enlightenment thinker, quite self-consciously embraces the Enlightenment and the value of knowledge, and at that stage, at least, precondition of the figure, the philosophical fiction of Zarathustra. He is quite explicit on the importance of a knowledge of human nature and human history as a precondition for thinking about new ways of being and new attitudes toward life.
You say fish swim and humans sing. Heidegger says birds sing, humans say being. But this is a specific Aristotelian telos. So pressing onto these questions, like Aristotle himself toys with the question, well, what if the human telos is to do nothing? He rejects that. He says, no, it is to think. This is the human telos. And so when you say, when, for example, Nietzsche says, there is no, I find in Spinoza no teleology, in a sense, we could say, no, it is here, it is to think. Now the thing is, this thought is not a norm to be found either in nature or in God, God being nature. So it is something specifically human. Like God, in that sense, does not think. He is somehow morose or stupefied. It's a God that doesn't think. So this human does not partake either in nature, in that sense, or in God. In which case there is a specific insulation and solitude of humanity, because otherwise, there could be an exemplar in God, imago and similitudo Dei. There could be this aspiration to think like God, and for example, to be like God, to love thy neighbor as God loves you. For example, as Kierkegaard says. So what I mean to say, there is this fissure, there is this split in man thinking and nature and God not thinking. And so that, in a way, God is in constant kind of war with nature and God, and at the same time also in constant war within oneself. Because while man is free to think, I'll be very, very quick, I'll wrap it up, yeah. So while this man is free to think, man does not have a free will. So there is a fissure between man's free thought and man's free will. So isn't that alienation, like this constant fissure between man and nature and God on the one hand, and within man himself, between man's supposed lack of free will and supposed freedom of thought?
I'm not entirely sure what the question is, but I mean, if it is the specificity of human nature, I mean, I think that is something that Spinoza and Nietzsche both share, but they understand that specificity of human nature as a being that thinks, or as we were stressing in relation to Nietzsche's application of his cosmology of will to power to human being. This is a being that not only exercises its power, but does so consciously and in the light of an understanding of its actions, their content, their aim, and so on. In other words, thought for Nietzsche, no less than for Spinoza, is the crucial and significant difference of human nature from the rest of nature, which doesn't give it any particular privilege, but it does mean that it is a specific element of nature. So I don't think there is a difference, but I don't see it as a fissure or as something that is problematic in their working out of that conception.
I mean, just to echo that, I would say in Spinoza, God thinks. There's no fissure or split or gap between man, nature, and God in terms of, they're different powers of thinking, different powers of thought. But we've got such fundamental interpretive. We have such fundamental interpretive disagreements that I think we might have to chat later about it. Yeah.
Okay, well, we've got at least one more question, so let's see how far we can get. Alex. Really?
Yeah, go, get someone else.
Okay.
I mean, mine's actually quite straightforward, so you might be quick. It's just I was quite interested in this idea. From what I understand, Spinoza really values human relationships in terms of the utility of thinking, like this power of thinking that all humans have. So it's good to sort of relate to other human beings in order to exchange that power. But then the example that Zarathustra at the end is on its own. So my question is, should the exemplar actually overcome this tendency to interact with other human beings? Is isolation the final sort of, the exemplar's living environment? Is that what it should be?
I think that's a really interesting question. It's one that we talked about in writing this paper. It raises an interesting difference, and we've been, I guess, stressing similarities between and points of contact between Spinoza and Nietzsche, but one shouldn't deny significant differences. And one of them is their attitude towards non-human nature and animality in particular. And Moira touched on that at one point, in talking about the human capacity for imitation and the dangers. I mean, Spinoza is quite strong on the dangers of association with animals. Nietzsche, by contrast, makes great use of animas and figures of animality, and indeed in Zarathustra, many of Zarathustra's most significant relationships are not with other people, but with animals. But, I mean, so that is a difference, but I don't think, it doesn't lead me to want to think that the kind of self-overcoming that Zarathustra exemplifies is inevitably or necessarily a solitary one. I mean, I know Nietzsche is often read in that way as a hyper-individualistic thinker. I think it makes no sense, and even in Nietzsche's own terms, or in Zarathustra's account, it makes no sense to think of that kind of transformation of values and a way of life apart from community with other peoples. So I think there is scope, and this is again a longer conversation for teasing out the importance of human association, of forms of community that recognise and value cooperation with others, democratic and peaceful forms of communal association. I think, again, contrary to the way Nietzsche is often read, I think there is, one can find support for that in him as well.
There's one more question here.
You almost started answering my question as soon as you had right at the end. I'm interested in, because at the end of the lecture, the idea of the exemplar was very, very sort of individualistically spoken, whereas at the beginning we were talking quite a lot about the use of coercion within politics and democracy and stuff.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask for an example of an example of an exemplar within politics. I guess the sort of within the idea of the political, what would be a political exemplar?
Well, I mean, I think, again, this is very brief. One way to connect that transformation that Zarathustra undergoes, and one of the things that we drew attention to at the end was the insistence, the reluctance in Zarathustra to be a teacher, to tell others how to think or how to live. This is my way, what's yours? So in that sense, he exemplifies a certain kind of independence of thought. To go back to the passage from Human All Too Human, it's actually from the third book of that, The Wanderer and His Shadow, in which Nietzsche makes this, I think, sort of remarkable comment about his understanding of democracy and the value that he places on it as a democracy to come. What is it that he finds important and valuable in democracy? It is independence. Independence of opinion, independence of thought, independence of way of life and employment. So, putting those two together, for him, one might say, and much of his criticism in early works of democracy as it existed around him, its criticism of the system of political parties, the control that they exercise over ordinary voters, its criticism of ordinary voters insofar as many of them, and indeed as they did in Europe at the time, and arguably many still do today, lack the independence of thought and judgment required for a genuine democracy. So putting those two things together, one could say perhaps that an exemplar or an exemplary democratic citizen for Nietzsche would be an independent one, an independent thinker.
There's a question here, and I think that will have to be our last.
Yes, just coming back to the first question about self-consciousness. I wondered if it was also a question of the communication to others with the question of self-consciousness. So one could envisage that a prophet might in fact be self-conscious, very aware of the fact that he or she is creating a fiction that is then presented to the Jewish people or whoever, but that the duty would be to convey the fact that that is a fiction, to convey to others that they should be aware of the fact that this is a fiction, in the very act of also conveying the fiction. That would be perhaps part of this question of self-consciousness, because you argued that, or you argued that Spinoza argued that the prophets didn't have that self-consciousness, that felt that their imaginations were not fictions. But perhaps there are examples of rulers or prophets who are very aware of that. It's just that they regard power as being the ability to present that to others without allowing others to see the status of the fiction, without allowing others to have that self-consciousness of the fictionary status of these things.
I think they're very different cases. And you could have a benevolent dictator, say, who propagates a fiction, but that benefits the people.
Yeah.
So, some kind of benevolent tyrant or dictator, but nevertheless, that person or group of people or that power makes the decision that you, or the multitude, or the ordinary folk, are not capable or able to bear the truth that it's a fiction, say. So I think you could think about a prophet, you could think about a benevolent dictator, and the philosopher. There's interesting work on this, actually. Plato's noble lie, with the gold, the silver, and the bronze. And there is interesting work on Spinoza where some interpreters, some commentators have suggested that Spinoza really shouldn't have published what he published. Can people bear this? And it's a kind of, I don't know if Paul would agree, it's a kind of Nietzschean question almost, can you bear this?
Well, it's a recurrent theme of Nietzsche's comments about his own writings, for whom they are written and for whom, by whom they can be written.
Can I ask a quick question? I'm afraid I'm going to say no. I know there are lots of people who have questions to ask, and I hope there'll be plenty of opportunity to bring them up again in extra sessions. It doesn't seem quite fair to let you jump in queue. I hope that's all right. So now I think we should just close the session and thank Paul and Moira, and we shall return at 2 o'clock to hear John Rutherford. But Paul and Moira, thank you very much. It's a wonderful